The Kennedys, An American Drama, by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. The country had seen these windswept, photogenic faces at different stages of development, and watched their growth and change as if by time-lapse photography. They were, as one journalist had remarked, America's children. Yet while they had been in the spotlight all their lives, they had a curious innocence. The importance outsiders attached to being a Kennedy amused them. They gawked back at the tourists who peeked through the hedges at Hyannis. They scooped up sand from the public beach and sold it as Kennedy sand for $1 a bag. They stood at the fence and answered Kennedy questions. What does Jackie eat for breakfast? Where do the Kennedys shop? For $0.25 apiece. Then there was the third son, David, a lot like his father as a young man, shy, fragile, engaging once his inhibitions were conquered. Bobby teased him about his weaknesses, his sissy fondness for wildflowers, his lisp. Say, "My sister Courtney blows her whistle," Bobby would command, and grimace in a stage way when David said, "My sister Courtney blowth her whistle," and his tendency to cry. But Bobby had a soft spot for him, too, as if remembering how he himself had been the runt of a prior Kennedy litter. When he saw David being picked on, he would take him aside. "Don't let anyone buffalo you. Learn how to fight back and learn how to win." He took him to the sports director who helped all the children and asked him to give David boxing lessons. But while Bobby wanted his third son to be hardened, he also hugged the boy and tried to protect him, as if determined to spare him the sense of being lost in the Kennedy shuffle which he had once experienced. David, 13, who had been alone in a Los Angeles hotel room watching his father's victory statement on television when the shooting occurred, had also been in a daze. For much of the trip to Arlington, he had his head out of the window of the train, letting the wind batter his face. Once as they were entering a tunnel, Phil Kirby, David's close friend from Hyannis, whom Ethel had asked along to keep him company, noticed that David didn't see the protruding arm of a steel girder and yanked him back into the compartment to keep him from being decapitated. Both boys had their heads out the window again when a train running on a parallel track to theirs struck a group of bystanders at a crossing. 2 were killed, one of them cut in half under the wheels. David had been mesmerized by the bloody scene, unable to tear himself away until a Secret Service man got him back down into his seat. The impact was greatest on Bobby's own children, whom his magnetism had made the center of the clan. By the time of David's birthday on June 15th, marked by a spiritless party at Hickory Hill, whose high point was Bobby Jr.'s decision to put a laxative in everybody's milk, the heroic denial Ethel had been practicing since the funeral had begun to crack. Tension was thick in the house. The little kids and the girls were immune from Ethel's dark moods, but the big boys were not. On the threshold of manhood themselves, they seemed to pose painful questions about the fate of Kennedy males. Their mother punished them constantly and capriciously, almost as if she blamed them for reminding her of her dead husband. She told Joe he must be the man of the house now, and allowed him to sit in his dead father's chair at the dinner table. But when he hit his younger sister Carrie for making noise, she gave him the infantile punishment of having to walk up and down the stairs 100 times. Later Joe went into the yard and, in a moment of tenderness, took the hands of his younger brothers and sisters and began to sing the battle hymn of the Republic, their father's favorite song. Meanwhile, Ethel kept saying to Bobby Jr. and David, "Get out of here," as if the house itself, with all the pictures of family triumphs, were a sanctuary they defiled by their presence. A few days after David's birthday, Ethel and the kids flew with Teddy to Connecticut and chartered a boat from Mystic to Hyannisport. Ethel careened between gloom and febrile gaiety all during the trip. Once she took Bobby Jr. and David below and hit them repeatedly with a hairbrush, the first such punishment they could remember, and one that made them cry in spite of their teenager resolutions to be stronger than their mother. "I can't stand it any more," she said when they reached home port. "You guys have got to get away from here." Thus began a diaspora that would continue for years to come, a process of leaving and returning that symbolized the next generation's ambiguous tie to the Kennedy legacy. David was very conscious of the coup his brother had scored in having an adult who was fully devoted to him and ready to help him deal with the tragedy. "Lem could have chosen any of us," he said. "I remember the day it happened. Lem appeared and they just sort of walked off together. I thought to myself, Bobby's lucky. I wish I had someone." If his father's death hit David harder than the others, it was because there had been a special bond between them. Both were the runts of the litter, sandwiched into the middle of a large family, and because he had always been a sort of golden boy for the family, with his open freckled face and the wispy blonde hair both parents had always tousled when passing by, almost as if fingering some talisman. "If we ever go broke," Ethel had once told an interviewer, "we'll make a movie star of David and live off his earnings." He was the only one in the family who hadn't been enthusiastic about the run for the presidency. For weeks after his father's announcement, David had been plagued by recurring nightmares about Bobby's death. Distraught over episodes that seemed premonitory, and missing the special attention his father had given him, David had gotten in trouble for throwing rocks at cars passing by Hickory Hill. His father had taken time on the campaign plane to write a note that seemed directed to David as much as the members of the press to whhom it was delivered. "He feels very badly about what has happened and has apologized to all concerned, and I want to add that he is a good boy and has always been a source of great joy and pride to the family." The day of the California primary, he had joined his father in Los Angeles. The two of them had been swimming in the Malibu surf, and his feet had been cut from under him by a riptide. He had felt himself being carried out by the undertow when his father grabbed him, scraping his own head on the ocean floor as he reached for David's slippery arm. With a teenager's melodrama, David had decided that he owed his father a life, and would look for an opportunity to pay him back in the years ahead. That night, as he sat in front of the television set in his room in the Ambassador Hotel, and watched the images from the handheld cameras jostling to get a better view of the new Kennedy martyr bleeding on the floor downstairs in the ambassador's kitchen, one of the thoughts he had was that the debt would be forever undischarged. Once Joe and Bobby Jr. were taken care of for the summer, Ethel hustled David off to Austria with Chris Lawford as a companion. They went to Meyerhof, a tennis and ski camp run by the former tennis star Bill Talbot. They skied on a glacier in the morning and practiced volleys in the afternoon. After hours, David was introduced to the Grateful Dead and to sex. Some 17-year-old girl at the camp realized who I was and picked me up. I was hardly into puberty. Chris told me to take her out and try to feel her tits. I did it. All of a sudden, she was unzipping my pants and pulling them down, and sort of moaning about how bad she felt that my father had died. For the rest of their time in Austria, he and Chris sneaked out of their rooms at night with sleeping bags, which they took into the girls' dorms, propositioning girls there who they discovered felt guilt and morbid fascination over Bobby's death. They knew it was wrong, but they also knew it was part of a great change in their attitude toward everything having to do with being a Kennedy. "It was like watching a huge balloon lose its air," Chris said later. "Things just didn't have meaning anymore." An outstanding tennis player, Chris now found himself not caring whether he won or lost. "I'd be out on the court and I'd just say, 'The hell with it,' in the middle of the match and walk off. Before Uncle Bobby's death, I wouldn't have dared do that. It just wouldn't have been possible. You never gave up, never stopped trying to win." But those kinds of emotions didn't have much meaning anymore. David and I sort of decided together that there really wasn't any reason to try to be good anymore, so we might as well try to be bad. When David returned home, things were in a state of ongoing disorder. It had been difficult for Ethel to keep domestic help in the best of times. During the summer, there had been several resignations, and his 10-year-old brother Michael, most resilient of the children, had taken to answering the phone with the words, "Confusion here." Although the Hyannis compound was insulated by several acres, Ethel had played music so loudly that the neighbors had been forced to call the police. 7 months pregnant, she bounded around the tennis court every day, even though she was worried about the baby, which she had come to see as an obscure symbol of Kennedy will. In a doubles match pitting her and Jim Whittaker against Andy Williams and Art Buchwald, she had become so furious with frustration that she knelt down to bang her head on the court surface. As summer ended with a stream of friends visiting the family, Dave Hackett, Rosie Greer, Rayford Johnson, and John Glenn were the regulars. David kept waiting for someone to talk to him about his father's death. During a rare lull in his mother's almost non-stop activity, he cornered her in the kitchen and asked her about it. "It's not a subject I want to discuss," she snapped, elbowing her way by him. David spent time with his friend Philip Kirby, while Bobby hung out with some older boys, notably another neighbor, John Kelly. One afternoon when they were all together, Kelly happened to ask Bobby what he'd done with the LSD he'd sold him. Bobby tried to change the subject. When Kelly persisted, he said that he'd fed the drug to his parakeet. Later in the Kellys' garage, a favorite meeting place, after David had chided Bobby for keeping secrets from him, Bobby laid out some mescaline on a piece of wood and dared him to take it. Kirby, who had watched David try to prove himself time and again by taking dares, begged him not to take the drug. "Don't do that, David. Please don't do it." But Bobby egged him on, and after hesitating a moment, David swallowed the mescaline. Later on, when he was hallucinating, it seemed to him that the hedge Bobby was leaning against had sharp leaves. He asked Bobby to move away so he wouldn't get hurt, but Bobby laughed and backed deeper into the hedge, whose spine seemed to David to penetrate his brother's body. "You're dying," he cried out, "just like Daddy." Bobby smiled and sagged to the ground with his eyes staring and his tongue lolling out of his mouth in a mime of death. Daddy, the personification of a love they would never again feel, and of a moral order they would never again experience. As the worst year of their young lives came to a close, they decided to surprise their mother at Christmas with a book comprised of letters about their father. David's said, "Daddy was very funny in church because he would embarrass all of us by singing very loud. Daddy did not have a very good voice. There will be no more football with Daddy, no more swimming with him, no more riding, and no more camping with him. But he was the best father there ever was, and I would rather have him for a father for the length of time I did than any other father for 1,000,000 years."